You ever get in a fight with someone, and after a while of back and forth, you eventually come out on top, and then since you won, you have to eat them within 3 days? No? Just me? If you're a Skyrim player too, chances are you've heard of the Bosmer, right?
Would have.
Whispers from NPCs, or maybe a lore book here or there describing the absolute atrocities this group of elves committed on the battlefield. You may have also heard that they've sworn off this practice during your time in Skyrim or Oblivion.
Would have.
But ESO takes place about 1,000 years before that. All I'm saying is a lot can happen in 1,000 years, right? Look, I'm a huge Bosmer fan, and trust me, you're gonna hear about that later. But maybe, I'm starting to understand why some people in the Aldmeri Dominion want the Wood Elves to renounce the Green Pact. If I was fighting a war, I'd prefer it if my brother in arms didn't start looking at me like a Sunday roast after I got a minor flesh wound. After being threatened to be consumed at least 10 times in this zone, I get that people should have their own culture and ideals, but I'm starting to understand where other people are coming from. Welcome to the Cannibal Zone, ladies and gentlemen. We're taking a tour deep into the jungle and right to the capital of the Wood Elves, Grahtwood. If you missed out on our last episode about the Veiled Inheritance, Prince Naaman, Estray, and the Zone of Auradon, I'll make sure to throw a card on screen now. This is the next chronological zone in the Aldmeri Dominion storyline, so if you haven't seen the first episode, fair warning, there will be spoilers and information you might not understand. I will be referencing that video quite often throughout this one, because the storyline does carry over, so if you'd like to go watch it, please do so now. Welcome to a Skyrim player tries to 100% the Elder Scrolls Online, where I lock myself into each of ESO's zones one at a time, only allowed to leave after it's been 100% complete. And we're not talking about the basic 100%, we're talking about the full zone guide, all fish, all books, all achievements, all side quests. If it's in this panel, it must be done before I can move on. Most of these zones I'll be playing in are over 10 years old.
Oh, hell no.
We're gonna see how well the stories and designs hold up after a decade, and try to provide an objective opinion because I've never played most of them before. I'm gonna be playing ESO like the developers intended. No spamming through dialogue, no skipping the best mob farming locations. We're gonna treat each zone like it's its own standalone experience. So let's talk about the grind. It took me 22.3 hours to 100% complete the zone of Grahtwood. And you know, that sounds like a lot, but it's not too bad because Auradon took me roughly 35 hours. So this was noticeably faster. In this segment of the video, the grind segment, we're only going to be touching on things that took me a notable amount of time to complete or posed a significant challenge to me as an individual player. Basic stuff like way shrines, striking locales, armor stations, mundus stones are irrelevant when it comes to grinding through a zone, right? Because they only take about 5 to 10 minutes off the beaten path to complete each. The first thing we're going to start with didn't pose a direct challenge to me, but I am feeling a little bit of grind towards this activity, and that's the delves. And I enjoy delves. I really like doing them, but there's one delve design in particular, the classic Ayleid Ruin delve. I'm seeing it over and over again. Nissalos and Wormroot are two different delves in Grahtwood, different delves in different locations. However, they both have an identical design and objectives are in the exact same location. Granted, the quests for each delve are different, which is the saving grace, but the interior is exactly the same. Okay, so let's move on to the activity that took me the most amount of time to complete, and that is the Point of Interests. In Grahtwood, there are 17 of these Points of Interest missions, and they were either certified bangers or not memorable at all. There wasn't really much in between. It took me roughly 6 hours to do them all. The average mission length was closer to 20 minutes compared to Auradon, which was closer to 30 or 40 minutes. Again, not difficult content, but about 30% of the time I spent in Grahtwood was doing POI missions. And to highlight a few of my favorites, Gilvardel was really cool. You had to help some dark elves who serve Almalexia to get rid of a dolmen. This is the first time I've seen a quest actually explain what dolmens are and their purpose, so it had me very interested the whole time. The Bone Orchard. Besides having a hilarious name, it was a really dynamic questline that had some really impactful decisions to make along the way. Dringoth had some pretty funny lines and the voice actor was really good.
Quite the view from up here, eh?
I'm at the landscape. Don't get any ideas?
It had a very interesting moral story about putting yourselves in someone else's shoes, and I really enjoyed it. The Brackenleaf questline might be the most immersive side quest storyline I have ever done. I don't really want to spoil it, but as a Bosmer fan, this was really cool. The cherry on top was you got to pick a spirit animal, and upon completing the quest, you got a buff on your character like a Mundus Stone. That reward specifically really felt like something you'd see in Skyrim, and it made the storyline super memorable. Finally, there's Leiloria, where you get to interact with the Daedric Prince Azura. I love any chance I get to interact with Daedric Princes, so this was already going to be one of my top favorites. The storyline itself is pretty basic. She needs your help to rescue one of her priests being tortured in Cold Harbor by Molag Bal. But the lore implications of her story and how Azura is trying to keep Molag Bal's legions away from Tamriel was really cool to hear. Some of the POI missions were a bit lackluster. There were quite a few that were basically just fetch and retrieve missions. A big reason I'm enjoying ESO over some of the other MMOs I've played are due to the high quality of side quests and lack of fetch and retrieve missions. Don't get me wrong, I know they exist in ESO like every single other MMO, but mainly they're picked up from minor side quests, like a random NPC on a beach who's too scared to go into a cave to get their books or something. I was a little disappointed to see these types of missions appear in a point of interest, because I tend to deem POIs as higher quality questlines, but unfortunately there were a handful of lackluster fetch and retrieve missions tied to points of interest in Grahtwood, and I can't say I remember that from Auradon. World bosses are up next, and boy oh boy did you guys warn me. One of the #1 comments I got in my last video, maybe the most frequent comment, was how world bosses got way harder as you progress, and just because the Auradon world bosses were easy doesn't mean the rest of the zones were. I was able to solo 2 out of 6 of the world bosses in Grahtwood, and to do so, I had to switch to third person for the first time. I know a lot of people don't like first person, but it's the most immersive experience for me, and how many MMOs can you name that let you go first person? 99% of MMOs are either third person or isometric, so I'm taking advantage of the first person while I can. That being said, it was necessary for some bosses. First person view doesn't really let you see underneath you, and with world bosses, you can die really fast by missing just 1 or 2 mechanics. I actually did die a few times. The first time my character has ever died was in Grahtwood. Overall, the world bosses weren't too bad, definitely harder than Auradon though. I found most of the time there were already groups farming the bosses, so it really didn't take me long to check them all off my list. I would entirely expect this to be much harder in a less populated zone, or maybe when ESO doesn't have a big event going on. The public dungeon was a piece of cake. I wouldn't even mention it in the grind category, but it is required for 50% of the zone's achievements. I did most of it solo, but there were a few people farming it already. I found the public dungeon in Auradon quite challenging, and a few of you in the comments were surprised and told me it should have been easy. After I did the public dungeon, I realized you guys were probably right and reviewed my old footage. I opened up my inventory and the raw footage and saw that my gear was completely destroyed. Not like low durability, it was like 0. So I'm assuming that means they weren't giving me like stats or like anything at all, so that's probably why I found it super difficult. Speaking of public dungeons, let's talk about the actual dungeon. I originally thought these weren't required for a zone 100%, but it turns out the dungeon in Grahtwood anyway has a lore book in it. I was missing that last lore book for a while and I couldn't find it anywhere, so I had to Google where it was. The lore book itself isn't right at the start either, so I couldn't just dip in and grab it. It's like halfway through, so I had to queue up for a dungeon with a group of people. So although the dungeon itself isn't technically required to 100% Grahtwood, you still have to go about halfway to get the lore book, so it's kinda required. Other than that, the lore books weren't much of a challenge at all. Almost all of them I found along my travels, and I really had to go out of my way to get them. Finally, let's talk about fishing. You guys are insane. I received over 30,000 pieces of bait from you guys. 30,000! Some of you asked to remain anonymous, and I would respect that, but for those of you who didn't, I'm going to be putting your names up at the bottom of the screen right now, so just to give you a little bit of credit, I made sure to track everybody who gave me some, and how much you gave me, and put it in an Excel sheet, so hopefully one day I can repay that favor. A handful of you sent me 100,000 gold, and I'll be including your name in the strip below. However, one person, Mooney1, sent me 10 million gold. Yes, you heard me right. I don't really know how much 10 million is in ESO nowadays, but I strongly suspect I'm never gonna need gold again. So I just want to say thank you. You guys are crazy. I'm pretty sure I don't need anything anymore. If you do want to send me stuff, you can check the description. My username is down there along with my server. But I definitely don't think I need anything anymore. Getting back to the actual fishing, it only took me about 3 hours this time. Some people were kind enough to send me this like purple soup that boosts my luck. I'm assuming it's very effective regarding how fast I did the fishing in this zone compared to Ordon, which took me like over 8 hours to catch everything. So that's it for the grind category. And before we get into the story category, let's take a step back and talk about the new province we're in. And I'm not talking about new zone, I'm talking province. We are now in the province of Valenwood, a place that's never been explored in another Elder Scrolls game before. Never. As I'm sure you know, there's about 10 major provinces in Tamriel. We just finished Auradon, which is the smaller island in the Somerset Isles, and we are now moving into Grahtwood, which is the southern eastern region of Valenwood. So although I may have picked up a book or heard an NPC talk about Valenwood in Skyrim or Oblivion, these places have only existed in my imagination. It's never been physically rendered before. It's hard for me to articulate how interesting that is for me personally. It's a different type of fascination compared to exploring areas that I've already seen before. I know Morthal exists in Skyrim in ESO, I actually made a video on it. I know Leowyn exists in Oblivion and ESO, but now I get to actually experience an area of Tamriel, a world I've probably spent thousands of hours in that previously only existed because of whispers, rumors, or a random book here or there. I promise I'm not going to talk your ear off about Valenwood all day, but as someone whose first Oblivion character was a Bosmer archer, Valenwood just means something a little more to me. Getting into the actual story and taking from your suggestions from the last video, I'll be introducing a segment here called Notable Characters, a quick refresher and spotlight on all the important characters in a given zone's main story. For Grahtwood, there's only a small handful. The most important probably is Prince Naaman, who's the Queen's brother and husband of Estray. Estray, of course, was the primary antagonist of the Auradon campaign in our previous video. Understandably, he's not your biggest fan, but he continues to serve his sister for the good of the Aldmeri Dominion. Queen Irene is probably the next most important character, even though she only shows up for the last mission. She is the center of this zone's plot, even though she's not necessarily present during it. I can't even think of another notable character. I suppose King Cameron is important, although not super impactful in this zone's story. King Cameron is the ruler of the Wood Elves and leads the city of Eldenroot, the Aldmeri Dominion faction capital. He's chill, I guess. I don't really know what more to say about him. He's not a huge character. With that out of the way, let's try and get a quick 3-minute story recap in. When you land in Grahtwood for the first time, you are tasked with assisting a local Khajiit force repel some pirates from the city of Haven. Mysteriously, there was supposed to be a Dominion army here, but it was withdrawn right before the pirate attack. This is a really cool story about pirates and necromancy, but it never comes up again. So, I guess I'm just gonna move on. You ride to the capital city of Eldenroot to find out what turmoil Queen Irene was originally worried about in Auradon. King Cameron basically introduces himself, throws in a quick cannibalistic joke about his subjects eating you for dinner. He tells you he's pretty busy, but you should speak with Prince Naaman regarding the unrest Queen Irene was originally worried about. So you head over to the Queen's brother, the Prince, who doesn't hide for 1 second his distaste for you. You know, because you killed his wife. Anyway, he says the Khajiit are pissed off because no one has built their embassy yet. You do some investigating and find out the laborers who were supposed to build the Khajiit embassy have been slaughtered. You meet one of King Cameron's loyal guard who was originally sent to investigate the same thing. You decide to team up and he has an idea of where the guilty party could be hiding. You follow your new friend and you discover the Veiled Heritance is behind the sabotage of the Khajiit embassy.
For the Heritance!
You and your new Wood Elf buddy deliver the guilty party to the king, but this poses a new problem. You have now discovered the Veiled Heritance is aware of Queen Irene's coronation ceremony. And since the Veiled Heritance does not like Queen Irene, it's safe to assume the ceremony has likely been sabotaged. The ceremony is set to take place in Eldenroot and uses an old artifact. The old artifact sees into your heart or something to determine if you have good intentions or not, and will either make or break Queen Irene's claim to rule the Aldmeri Dominion. You are then tasked with finding 3 MacGuffins that somehow will ensure the ceremony will go as planned. One must be obtained from the Daedric Prince Sheogorath, another from the winter site of Fallenesti, and one from a knockoff Medusa demon lady thing. Once you've got all 3 MacGuffins, you prepare for the coronation ceremony using the old artifact that will determine if Queen Irene is pure of heart. As the ceremony begins, Prince Naaman steps forward and snares everyone. Denouncing his sister's claim to the throne, he runs into the chamber of the old artifact, and it reveals his true nature, turning him into this big ogre thing you have to kill. You run it back, and you try it again with Queen Irene, and she steps into the chamber and comes out all sparkly glowy. Queen Irene has been proven to be pure of heart, and the artifact granted her a vision to secure peace. To do so, the queen sends you to secure the Staff of Magnus in Greenshade. So as I've previously mentioned, I am a bit biased when it comes to Valenwood because I love it so much, but I'll try to remain impartial. The story for Grahtwood in one sentence is, you need to find 3 MacGuffins for the Queen's coronation ceremony. I'm not even exaggerating, that's literally the main plot. Essentially, you are a royal party planner, and you gotta make sure the Queen has everything she needs for her surprise party. As suggested by you guys, I'm gonna split my impressions of the main story into pros and cons, things I think the story did well, and things I think it didn't do so well. Please keep in mind, everything I said is my opinion, and I am brand new to the game, so I may miss some details. Let's start with the main story's weaknesses. I think the coronation ceremony was pretty shallow as an overarching plot that's supposed to drive all other narrative devices. It's a little stinky. It doesn't feel like you've accomplished anything much by the end of the zone. We're essentially in the same spot we were at the end of Auradon, except maybe a few more Bosmer now trust the Queen as the right person to lead the Dominion. I understand that the ceremony is the Queen extending an olive branch to the Bosmer, improving her worth to them, but I don't think it's significant enough to be the climax of the main story. We run around all over getting party supplies, and the payoff is to have a secret ceremony that like 4 people see. At least with Auradon, it was a boss battle in a different plane of existence. That's cool, I will remember that ending. Grahtwood, maybe not so much. It was really short, like I finished the zone story in just under 4 hours. Maybe that's even a positive thing, because I wish it was longer, but there were only 8 missions, and you didn't really have to travel much to do them. This is a weird complaint, but Auradon's story had you traveling up the island slow and steady. You knew you started at the bottom, and the final encounter was probably going to be at the top. It had a level of subconscious progression as you moved up through the island. 80% of Grahtwood's story takes place in this strip you see on screen. It's just basically the main story and the 3 major sites you visit to get the artifacts. It's just all in that strip. Okay, so let's talk about the strengths, and my god, were there some really cool things to do in this story. They did an awesome job making the MacGuffin quests feel impactful and unique. Being able to meet a Daedric prince in the flesh was awesome. I know there's like 10 ways to say Sheogorath, Shoggorath, like, I know there's a lot of ways to say it, but Sheogorath's voice actor was great too. He was really comedic and a little scary. Almost like if the Joker was a god and only came out to play when he was bored. Little disappointed by his outfit. I'm not sure if that's just an Elder Scrolls Online thing, but his clothes were like fused into his flesh. It had like no texture. It looked really, really weird. Fallen Esty. Oh my god. Remember how I said I was a lore nerd? Fallen Esty is constantly written about in previous Elder Scrolls games. Skyrim, Morrowind, Oblivion, all of them have books and scrolls about this city. Fallen Esty is the walking city of Valenwood, and it was this big tree thing that moved around. It was actually the original capital city before Eldenroot because it mysteriously disappeared. Now, side note, I heard it mysteriously disappeared in ESO because the developers couldn't find a way to code a walking city, so they had to kind of bake that into the lore as why the city disappeared. Little disappointing, but whatever. In Grahtwood specifically, you explore the winter site in the main story, meaning this is where the city planted its roots during the winter seasons. Fallen Esty is definitely the best documented and most famous thing about Valenwood. So for me, it was really cool to not just have it as a side quest, but actually part of the main story. We know the city of Fallen Esty returns before Oblivion because it plays a minor role in the setup of the Oblivion crisis due to the Cameron bloodline fighting about the throne of Fallen Esty, which again, super awesome to see the Camerons still ruling Valenwood 600 years or so before Oblivion. Really, really cool. Finally, there was way more player agency than Auradon, especially with the Sheogorath storyline. We were given multiple choices throughout that main story mission. You have some minor choices during the build-up. You can either kill this guy who's throwing lightning bolts or try to persuade him to stop. When you're locked in the dungeon, you can choose to fight more enemies or solve more puzzles. And for the climax, you can either fight the mayor or decide against it. I hope these were all real choices, and I only say that because it's Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness. It's possible it's the illusion of choice, and you just have to do whatever you want anyway, but it did feel cool to potentially have a different ending for that storyline than what other people may have experienced. Quick sidebar here before we get into the verdict. I wanted to thank you guys so much for all the support. When I put up my last video, I was expecting 200 to 300 views maximum. I don't know what happened, but by the time of writing this script, my last video has over 40,000 views in less than a week. That is viral to me. That is a viral video. To top it off, you guys have been subscribing like crazy. I went from 600 subscribers to over 2,000. My videos aren't monetized or anything like that, and they take me weeks to make. So if you're enjoying the content, I would greatly appreciate it if you consider dropping a like or subscribing. I promise I'm not going to be one of those YouTubers who spams your sub box with low quality videos. Everything I make requires a crazy time commitment, so that's not really possible. Regardless, I just wanted to squeak in a thank you into this video. I can't tell you how happy it's made me to find people who enjoy the stuff I make. It's an incredible feeling. So with all that mushy stuff out of the way, I also wanted to mention that on my last video, you guys asked a lot of questions. So I want to do a quick 1 or 2 minute rapid fire Q&A to answer the questions I most commonly was asked. Have you heard of Khenarthi's Roost? In my last video, I claimed Auradon was the starting zone for the Aldmeri Dominion, which led people to think that I was not aware of what Khenarthi's Roost was and that I may have skipped it. I have actually played it. There's a video on this channel about the Khenarthi's Roost storyline I made almost 2 years ago. But keep in mind, it's not a 100% challenge video. It's more about the lore of the island, the Maumur or Sea Elves, and Pyandania. Regardless, I did actually 100% Khenarthi's Roost anyway, and this was the first thing I did. But my first impression of it was it was more of a tutorial island. It took me like 2 hours to 100% the entire zone, so I assumed it wasn't the starter zone and it was just for noobs. Nevertheless, I have played it, I enjoyed it, and coincidentally, I did make a video on it a few years ago. How familiar am I with ESO's DLC system and endgame? I've probably tried to play ESO on about 4 to 5 different occasions, but I mainly played on the PlayStation. This account I'm using is actually my dad's. He stopped playing a few years ago and gave me the account when I mentioned I was interested in trying it out on PC. He had purchased Clockwork City, Orsinium, Thieves Guild, and some other DLC dungeons. I believe his main character on the account is CP600 or something. He said that his levels would carry over for me, but I don't really know what that means. Am I aware of the main storyline of ESO that takes place in Cold Harbor? I am. The main storyline is the only thing in ESO I've done more than once. I've actually progressed to the Cold Harbor zone twice, which I think requires about 50% or 70% of the story to be complete. So I do think I remember enough of it. As I mentioned, in this zone, there's a side quest where Almalexia told a dark elf to wait for someone with no soul to help him. I understood that that's me and why I have no soul. That being said, it's not super fresh in my mind, I will admit, and I think when I'm done the Aldmeri Dominion storyline, I will do a Cold Harbor 100% video on the zone in the main campaign. I know it's technically supposed to be interwoven while doing the faction storylines, but I feel like I know enough about it to where it's not hindering my experience. Can you play X Zone next? I plan to play everything. However, I am doing the Aldmeri Dominion storyline first in its entirety. After the Dominion storyline, I would like to squeeze in the main quest in Cold Harbor Zone, as I previously mentioned. However, once the Cold Harbor Zone is done, I will do one zone of your request before jumping into the next faction of your request. If you would like to vote for me to play either the Daggerfall Covenant or the Ebonheart Pact storyline next, you will find a link to a community poll in the description of this video. Okay, we're at the final piece of the puzzle, my final verdict of the zone. And just like Auradon, we're going to give Grahtwood a star ranking out of 5. The 5-star ranking comprises 3 smaller categories: the zone itself, its environment and design, the main story of the zone, and finally, the side content of the zone. Starting off with the zone ranking, and I don't really know what to do here. I think I have to give Grahtwood a 3 out of 5 in respect to its environment and zone design. Its environment alone would get a 4 out of 5 for me personally. As I said, I do have a little bit of bias, but I think Grahtwood is beautiful. It's the perfect mix of jungle and redwood forest. The Bosmer architecture is amazing and super unique, but you also get to see Khajiit, Altmer, and Orc designs scattered across the zone. I love the booming thunderstorms and the rolling fog that gets illuminated by the lightning. The ambience of the zone is fantastic too, not just the wildlife sounds, but you can hear the trees groaning and twisting as you walk through the forest. What knocks Grahtwood down to a 3 out of 5 instead of a 4 is due to the zone design. Grahtwood only has 2 major cities equipped with the essentials, Eldenroot and Haven. Haven's city design is disastrous. It splits up the city into 3 areas, all which require quick time loading to access. There's literally zero reason for it, because you can parkour over the walls and you can skip the quick loads anyway, so why are there doors? Eldenwood itself is pretty magnificent. It was my first real experience of an ESO hub city. I've never seen that many players before. It was teeming with so many players, I was actually dropping FPS just by being there. Just comparing Grahtwood cities to Auradon, I feel like Auradons are much cleaner in terms of design, and they actually felt like real cities. Now, to ESO's credit, Grahtwood absolutely feels like a zone which Bosmers would live. It's chaotic and disorganized, but that's because the Bosmer adhere to the Green Pact, and they would have had to make do with the local vegetation without harming it. Although thematically and environmentally it's really well designed, the other issue I have with Grahtwood are its mountains, and how the mountains feel like they block off a lot of the zone. A large chunk of the central region around the capital is non-traversable, or only traversable from one side of the mountain. It wasn't really worth it for me to try and walk to certain locations through the jungle or off the beaten path, knowing I might run face first into an unpassable cliff face. Thematically, this does make a lot of sense for a Bosmer inhabited zone, but it still takes away some of the enjoyment of a less restrictive environment, at least for me. I really don't like using fast travel in Skyrim or in ESO. I barely even use my mount. I prefer to walk so I can take in the area as best as I can, and unfortunately in Grahtwood, I found myself using way shrines far too often for my liking, but again, this is all personal preference. So for me, although I think the environment looks great, the design is a little bit constricting for my preference, and that's why it gets a 3 out of 5 instead of a 4 out of 5. We've already touched on the story quite a bit for Grahtwood, and I'm going to assume you watched that segment so I won't rehash the details. Overall, I'd give the story content for Grahtwood a 3 out of 5. We're expected to run around for days finding supplies for the Queen's coronation ceremony, and that in essence doesn't provide much motivation, if I do say so myself. Now, where Grahtwood's story shines is ironically the 3 MacGuffins of the main plotline. I'm a big Elder Scrolls lore guy, and if you're not, you probably wouldn't appreciate it as much as I did. The weakest of the 3 was the Medusa Daedra, which is still an interesting story at its heart compared to the rest of the main campaign. I've already gushed about Fallen SD and how important it is for Valenwood, and I promised I wouldn't talk more about it. But I think the best mission I played was the one with Sheogorath. It had some great choices to make and really demonstrated how powerful a Daedric prince was, showing how he just saw us as playthings and how he could make the most powerful mage in the zone bend to his will at any time. Also, I'm willing to admit, Prince Naaman's betrayal was a bit of a twist. We know he hates our guts for what we did to his wife, but he's always been loyal to the Aldmeri Dominion and believes in its merit. Unlike Esme's betrayal, which I think everyone saw 100 miles away, Prince Naaman's was a bit better written, and you can feel the loss for the Dominion. He was an important guy to the faction. He felt grounded as a character. He didn't like the hoops his sister was jumping through to please the population back in Auradon or in Grahtwood. He believed in logic and believed tradition and faith were useless for an effective leader. Even in the end, he betrayed his sister, but not to spite her. It was because he thought she wasn't the best choice for the Dominion. Grahtwood still leaves a lot to be desired narratively on the main story. The first mission, Haven, provides a very interesting hook to the story, but it's thrown away after you've liberated the city. You never go back to Haven, you never interact with the pirates or Khajiit mercenaries you originally assisted, they're just tossed in the garbage. The next 2 missions about the embassy and the Veiled Inheritance also felt a bit weak as we never really returned to them. I understand they were kind of important in setting up the plot, but we also have no idea if the poor Khajiits ever got their embassy built. Overall, this story was, in all regards, objectively better than Auradon's. Still a bit shallow in the overall story arc, but when it came down to its unique questlines, it really shined through. When it comes to side content, Grahtwood had some certified bangers. The peak of Grahtwood's side content was much better than Auradon, but also its lows were lower than Auradon. Thankfully, there weren't very many lows. I'd give Grahtwood a 4 out of 5 stars in terms of side content. I've only played 3 zones so far, so I don't know if this means much, but this zone had the best side content so far, bar none. I got to talk to the wise mystical tree who gave me superpowers. I got to help a new Daedric prince plan a heist in Cold Harbor. I helped free some of my fellow Argonians who were previously held as slaves by the Dark Elves. I got to cosplay Indiana Jones. I got to play human chess like Harry Potter. There's so many things that jump out to me as memorable in Grahtwood, and I'm really thankful I did 100% this zone. Not to mention the ample amounts of player agency we got with the side content. You can decide entire outcomes of the story with just one click of a button, which I think is really cool. There's also some neat world-building random encounters you'd see on the side of the road. 2 or 3 people having an argument that you could settle. It wasn't a quest or anything, but it's a really great intimate RPG detail. Completely optional, but draws you in to talk to some of the NPCs you probably would have originally ignored. I've spoken already about a few of the delves not being super great, but the rest were a lot of fun. World bosses were definitely tougher, but I was still able to solo a few of them. I doubt that'll be the case for Greenshade though. Overall, Grahtwood gets a 3.5 out of 5-star rating from me. The region of Valenwood has never been tackled by another Elder Scrolls game before, so this is 100% new content. I know the Somerset Isles is also technically in the same boat, but ESO actually made all of Valenwood in the base game. Ordon is like 20% of the Somerset Isles, so it's not as exciting to go through all of Valenwood in the next few weeks. Grahtwood's environment may not be as pretty as some of the other zones, but it really drives home the green-packed feel with its towns, villages, and settlements around the zone. I did find it odd the Dominion considers Eldenroot to be the capital of the whole faction, as it's not really a city at all, it's just a tree filled with traders. Regardless, I had a fantastic time going through this zone, and I'm excited to see what's in the next chapter of the Aldemary Dominion. With that being said, this was a Skyrim player's perspective on being locked in Grahtwood until 100%. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in Greenshade.